The camp stood at the edge of a pine forest where the wind moved like a slow tide through the branches, and the watchtowers rose above the trees with the same inevitability as the seasons. It was a prisoner-of-war camp built for function rather than cruelty, a place of confinement where days stretched in long, repetitive lines. Barbed wire defined the horizon. Beyond it lay fields, a railway line, and the smoke of a village that most prisoners knew only as a smudge through fog. The guards paced their routines with quiet precision. Their boots and the rattle of keys formed a soundtrack to the monotony. The war existed beyond the fence, yet it permeated everything inside, shaping the air and the posture of every human being who lived under its regime. Barracks, made of thin boards, housed men from different countries who had once defined themselves by uniforms and flags, but now measured identity by the weight of hunger and the rhythm of work details. The camp command issued regulations about sanitation, rations, and assemblies. The prisoners learned to adopt the same economy of movement seen in the guards, conserving warmth and energy in the long winter. They rebuilt stoves from scrap, converted crates into shelves, and stitched clothing from blankets until the wool formed a second skin. They traded skills without words. A carpenter bartered with a tailor, an interpreter with a medic, each offering fragments of normal life as if pieces of a lost map. Work parties left at dawn for tasks outside the wire, clearing snow, stacking fuel, repairing a road damaged by weather and neglect. Those who stayed behind swept the paths, maintained the latrines, and kept the pot of thin soup turning slowly on the central fire. In the evenings, light fell early, and the barracks became small islands of heat. Time resisted any attempt to fill it. Some men wrote letters that would never leave the camp. Others etched dates into the wood of their bunks. A few recited poetry under their breath, not for an audience, but to keep memory active, like a muscle that would waste if ignored. Among the prisoners were men who had once played instruments in conservatories, village bands, and school orchestras. Their hands had changed under captivity, the muscles reconfigured for shovels and rope, but a trace of their old discipline persisted. In the half-dark, they tapped rhythms on tabletops and leaned toward the faint sound of a harmonica that someone had made from a piece of tin and a fragile reed. The tones were imperfect, often out of tune, but they held a shape that the barbed wire could not bend. No one planned what would come next. There was no manifesto, no grand idea. It began with small gestures. A melody memorized from childhood. A line of a hymn played softly enough not to draw attention. An unspoken understanding that sound could occupy a space in the camp that regulations did not anticipate. The guards heard it as background, a harmless murmur like wind or rain. The prisoners felt it as a subtle rearrangement of the day, a realignment of breath that carried them from one hour to the next. In this way, before there were instruments or an audience, music entered the camp like mist through the trees, impossible to forbid because it arrived without a door. By the middle of winter, the rhythm of life in the camp had settled into a pattern so predictable that even silence seemed scheduled. Days began with the whistle at dawn and ended with the counting of prisoners before dark. Between those two moments stretched a repetition that threatened to erase thought. Yet within that repetition, a few men began to assemble something fragile, an act that defied both boredom and despair. It started with wood. The barracks walls were made from cheap pine planks, but among the firewood pile near the kitchen lay a crate that had once carried medical supplies. The crate's boards were smoother, denser, and when one of the prisoners, a Polish musician named Marek, tapped them with his knuckles, the sound was resonant. He lifted the piece carefully, listening. The wood, though warped, vibrated like the memory of a note. That single tone became the seed of an idea that spread quietly through the barracks. Tools were forbidden, but ingenuity replaced what rules denied. Nails were straightened and turned into makeshift chisels. A fragment of glass served as a knife. Horsehair from a worn-out brush was saved for strings, Bits of copper wire scavenged from a broken lamp became tuning pegs. The men worked at night, hidden by the dull glow of a single candle, taking turns to carve and smooth. Every sound had to be muffled, the scrape of metal on wood covered by coughing or footsteps, the soft tapping timed with the changing of the guard. It took weeks before the rough outline resembled a violin. The shape was imperfect, slightly asymmetrical, but to those who watched, it looked like a relic from another world. The bow was a miracle of improvisation, bent wood, horsehair bound by thread, resin made from wax and soot. When Marek drew it across the strings for the first time, the sound that emerged was thin and uncertain, yet it carried something powerful. The memory of freedom translated into vibration. Word spread quietly through the barracks. On nights when the guards were less alert or the snow fell heavily enough to absorb noise, the prisoners gathered in silence to listen. The melodies were simple, often fragments of folk songs remembered from childhood. The notes rose and dissolved into the air, merging with the sound of wind against the walls. For a few minutes, the boundaries of the camp faded. The music did not erase the barbed wire, but it softened its edges. The guards noticed eventually. One evening, a young sentry paused outside the barracks and listened, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. He did not report it. Perhaps he saw no danger in the fragile tones, or perhaps he recognized something human that the war had not yet destroyed. From that night, the violin was no longer only an act of defiance. It became part of the camp's quiet equilibrium, an unspoken exchange between captor and captive, where both found a brief suspension of duty. Marek repaired the instrument constantly. The wood cracked in the frost, the strings snapped, yet each time the violin returned to life. The sound was not beautiful by ordinary standards, but it was real, and in a place built to suppress identity, that was its own form of rebellion. By the time spring approached, other prisoners began crafting instruments from whatever they could find, a drum from a can, a flute from pipe scrap, and even a crude guitar with strings of wire. None of it should have worked, but together it formed a sound that belonged to no army, no country, and no rule. When spring reached the forest, it came quietly. The snow retreated from the edges of the barbed wire, and patches of frozen ground turned into mud. The air still carried the smell of smoke and iron, but it was no longer the smell of pure winter. In the camp, routines remained unchanged, yet something in the rhythm of the days began to shift. The prisoners walked with slightly longer strides, their eyes lifted toward the treetops. The guards loosened their pace, their coats unbuttoned in the new warmth. Life did not improve, but it expanded enough to breathe. By then, the violin was no longer the only source of sound. From spare parts and discarded scraps, a collection of instruments had taken form, crude but functional. There was a tin drum built from a food container, a flute fashioned from copper pipe, and a broken accordion salvaged from a warehouse by a work detail. None of the pieces matched in tone or pitch, yet when played together, they formed a rhythm that belonged to no one, yet somehow to everyone. It was Marek who suggested that the music should be played not just in secret but for all to hear. He said it without words, a look across the barracks, a motion toward the open yard. The idea spread through nods, gestures, and brief whispers. Even those who had no musical skill felt drawn to it. The thought of sound filling the empty space between the barracks seemed impossible, and for that reason alone, it became necessary. The preparations were simple. During work detail, the men collected a few boards and built a small platform between two barracks, near the central fire pit. It was not an official stage, merely a raised surface that could be mistaken for a repair project. The guards saw it, but asked no questions. On the evening chosen, the prisoners gathered in silence, their clothes worn, their faces drawn but alert. The light was dim, fading into dusk. The sound of distant artillery echoed faintly across the fields, a reminder that the war outside still raged, though here, for a few moments, it receded. When the first note rose from the violin, it wavered, uncertain against the air. Then the flute joined, then the drum, slow and careful. The melody was one that no one fully recognized, part folk tune, part invention. It wound through the camp like smoke, fragile and persistent. The guards on duty paused at their posts. They could have shouted for silence or ended it with a single command. Instead, they stood still. The music, though imperfect, carried a tone of dignity that required no translation. As the melody grew steadier, the prisoners began to hum softly, their voices low but united. For the first time in years, they were not merely counted bodies behind wire. They were participants in something chosen, something created. The sound filled the night air, and even when the wind carried it toward the towers, no one tried to stop it. When the final note faded, there was no applause at first, only quiet. Then, from the direction of the main gate, a slow, deliberate sound, the clapping of hands, hesitant but genuine. It was one of the guards, standing with his rifle slung, his face unreadable. Others joined in, softly, awkwardly, as though remembering what applause meant. The prisoners stood motionless, not in fear but in disbelief. In that moment, under the pale spring sky, the barbed wire still stood, the towers still loomed, but something within the camp had shifted. Music had crossed the boundary that orders could not. The following days carried an unfamiliar tension, not of fear, but of anticipation. The guards spoke little about the event, yet their behavior changed subtly. They no longer barked commands as sharply, and their movements seemed less rigid. Among the prisoners, an undercurrent of energy replaced the usual heaviness. The memory of that night lingered like the echo of a melody that refused to fade. For the first time in months, there was something to remember that was not pain, hunger, or loss. No official punishment followed. The commandant, a practical man concerned mainly with order, regarded the incident as harmless. Perhaps he saw in it a way to maintain calm within the camp, a distraction that cost nothing. Whatever his reasoning, he did not forbid the gatherings, provided they remained quiet and brief. The prisoners understood this as permission disguised as indifference, and they accepted it carefully. Soon the instruments appeared more often. In the evenings, small groups gathered in corners of the yard, playing quietly, while others listened. The tunes changed fragments of songs from different countries woven together by necessity. A Russian lullaby merged into a French waltz, followed by a march from somewhere in Italy. Each melody carried traces of the lives the men had lived before captivity. The music was not rebellion, it was remembrance, and in remembering, they found a way to remain themselves. The guards listened too. Some pretended not to notice, others lingered by the fence, pretending to adjust their rifles or check equipment. One of them, a young conscript from Bavaria, began to whistle along with the slower tunes, his notes tentative but in time. The prisoners did not react. Any acknowledgement could have broken the fragile balance that existed. Still, the sound traveled through the wire, dissolving the invisible wall that had separated two groups of men who had stopped being enemies but were not yet human to each other. As spring deepened, the camp changed in ways that had nothing to do with music, yet seemed connected to it. Fights between prisoners grew rarer. Work details returned more orderly. Even the guards, who had once spoken only in commands, exchanged brief words with those they supervised. The sound of music had altered the rhythm of the place, introducing a softness that neither side fully understood. One afternoon, while repairing the road beyond the outer fence, a group of prisoners discovered an old crate of supplies abandoned near a burned farmhouse. Inside were several metal parts that, when struck, produced clear ringing tones. They carried them back secretly, and within a week those sounds joined the nightly gatherings. The camp now had its own orchestra, crude, uneven, but real. On clear evenings, when the wind was still, the music carried beyond the wire, out into the forest. Villagers from miles away later said that they sometimes heard faint notes coming from the direction of the camp, though none could believe that such sounds could exist in a place built for captivity. By midsummer, the commandant himself attended one of the gatherings. He stood in the background, smoking, saying nothing. When the final song ended, he turned and walked away without comment. The next day, the kitchen received a double ration of bread for distribution among the prisoners. No explanation was given. What began as a secret act of survival had become a shared language. Music, once made from scraps and silence, now shaped the daily life of the camp. The war continued far beyond the forest, yet inside the wire, an unexpected peace had begun to take form. Fragile, wordless, and entirely human. By late summer, the forest around the camp had turned deep green, and the air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. The prisoners had adjusted to the new rhythm of evenings filled with sound. The guards had accepted it as a strange but harmless routine, yet nothing inside a wartime camp remained unnoticed for long. Reports traveled upward through ranks, each retelling altered slightly to fit the expectations of those above. Eventually, the story of music among the prisoners reached headquarters. It was a short note in a logistics report, an observation about morale, phrased carefully to suggest efficiency rather than sympathy. The idea that captured soldiers were calm and cooperative because of nightly gatherings intrigued someone at a higher post. An inspection was ordered. It was not the kind of inspection that looked for weapons or tunnels, but for discipline and adherence to protocol. The news of the visit spread quickly. The guards grew nervous, repainting the fences and tidying the yard. The prisoners were told to keep the barracks clean, their bedding in order, their uniforms neat. For 3 days, the camp took on the strained quiet of a theater before a performance. Marek, the violin maker, hid his instrument beneath a floorboard. Others dismantled their makeshift instruments or buried them under straw. Music, the very thing that had restored their humanity, became again something dangerous. The inspectors arrived in the afternoon, 2 officers in pressed uniforms, their boots spotless, their expressions measured. They walked through the camp, accompanied by the commandant, who moved with the cautious politeness of a man balancing on thin ice. The officers examined the barracks, checked the kitchen, reviewed the logs. Everything appeared ordinary. Then one of them mentioned the rumor. The commandant hesitated only briefly before admitting that the prisoners sometimes played music in the evenings. He added that it helped maintain order and reduced conflicts. His tone was neutral, his words chosen with precision. The officers exchanged a glance. They ordered a demonstration, curious to see this phenomenon themselves. That evening, a group of prisoners was assembled in the yard. The guards stood by, uncertain. The prisoners had no time to rebuild instruments or prepare. They produced what they could: the battered violin, a drum made from a tin, and a piece of pipe that still served as a flute. Marek stood in the center, pale but steady. The commandant gave a small nod, signaling them to begin. The first notes were weak, trembling under the gaze of authority. But as the melody unfolded, something shifted. The sound filled the courtyard, soft yet defiant. It was not the polished music of a concert hall, but the living pulse of men who had survived too long to forget their need for beauty. The officers remained motionless. When the final chord faded, they turned away without comment. The next morning, orders arrived from headquarters. The camp was to continue operating as usual, with no changes. But attached to the directive was a brief handwritten note from one of the inspectors. Music observed. Morale satisfactory. No disciplinary risk. The commandant folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and said nothing. The unspoken understanding spread quickly. The music would continue. What had been a secret act of defiance was now, by a bureaucratic accident, officially tolerated. And so, under the watchtowers and the same barbed wire, the orchestra of prisoners resumed its nightly gatherings, playing for themselves and for the unseen listeners beyond the fence. When winter returned, It came harder than anyone expected. The ground froze early, and the forest turned white before December. The wind carved through the barracks, whistling through gaps in the wood, filling every corner with the sound of the season's cruelty. The prisoners wrapped themselves in whatever scraps they could find, layering rags and blankets until movement became slow and heavy. Hunger deepened, and the nights stretched longer than seemed possible. The music, however, did not stop. The violin cracked from the cold, and the strings snapped one by one, but Merrick repaired it patiently, binding the wood with thread, melting candle wax to seal the fractures. The drum was now nothing more than a hollow tin, its skin worn thin. Yet somehow, each evening, a few sounds still rose from the yard, faint, trembling, but enough to remind the men that they were still alive. By then, both sides of the wire had changed. The guards, equally exhausted, no longer carried the sharpness of command. They were soldiers of habit rather than conviction, surviving the same frost, the same shortage of food, the same distance from home. When the music began, they gathered near the towers, stamping their boots for warmth, watching through the snow. One night, during a blizzard, the prisoners played again. Visibility was low, and the air was thick with white dust. Only the soft yellow glow of lamps marked where the barracks stood. The notes drifted through the storm, dissolving almost as soon as they were born. A handful of guards, their faces hidden by scarves, stood listening, their rifles lowered. One of them began to clap softly in rhythm, not mockingly, but to keep the pulse alive against the wind. Others followed. The sound of gloved hands clapping in the snow became the percussion the orchestra lacked. It lasted only a few minutes before the cold silenced everything. Yet when the prisoners returned to their bunks, the echo remained. The line between captor and captive had blurred once more, replaced by something simpler, people enduring the same winter, bound by the same fragile rhythm. That night, no one reported the music. The guard said nothing, and the prisoners did not speak of it either. But the next morning, someone had quietly left a bundle of dry firewood near the barracks door, an anonymous gesture that no rule could explain. The war outside raged on, yet within the camp, a strange equilibrium had taken hold. The snow fell, the frost bit deep, and still, behind the wire, the music survived. By the spring of 1945, the sound of the war beyond the forest had changed. The distant thunder of artillery came not from the east, but from the west now, moving steadily closer. Rumors passed through the camp in fragments carried by new prisoners and guards returning from leave. The Germans were retreating. The front was collapsing. The war, they whispered, was ending. Inside the camp, the routines continued: roll call, work details, the thin soup served twice a day, but the air carried a tension unlike any before. The guards no longer shouted orders with the same certainty. Some avoided eye contact altogether. The commandant stopped appearing in the yard. Trucks arrived, then left again, half empty. Everyone understood that something irreversible was approaching, though no one knew how it would reach them. The music persisted even as the camp dissolved around it. The violin, now worn to the color of ash, still produced sound, though faintly. The players gathered one last time in the open yard, surrounded by melting snow and the smell of thawing earth. The guards stood nearby, not to enforce discipline, but because they, too, wanted to witness what might be the camp's final night, as it was. The melody they chose was slow and uncertain, a composition of fragments remembered from the past 2 years. It began with a tune from Poland, shifted into something Russian, and ended with a sequence that no one could identify. The rhythm was uneven, the instruments faltering, yet together they created a sound that was neither joyful nor mournful, only deeply human. As the music rose, the guards began to lower their weapons, one by one. The youngest among them, barely 20, removed his cap and held it against his chest. No orders were given. The war was still raging elsewhere, but here, behind the wire, it was already over. The last note hung in the air, trembling between snow and sky, and then faded into silence. The next morning, the camp gates were open. The guards were gone. Some prisoners walked out immediately. Others hesitated, unsure if it was a trick. Merrick carried his violin beneath his coat and stepped through the gate he had stared at for years. The forest beyond was the same as before, but now it no longer belonged to anyone. He turned once to look back. The camp stood quiet, empty, the wind moving gently through the wire that had once held them. No one clapped this time. There was only stillness, vast and final. Yet somewhere in that silence remained the echo of their last song, fragile, unfinished, but free. In the years that followed, the camp disappeared from maps. The wooden barracks were dismantled, the watchtowers collapsed, and the wire rusted into the soil. The forest grew back, swallowing the traces of fences and paths. Only the concrete foundations remained, scattered among moss and roots like bones of a forgotten creature. Travelers who passed through the area saw nothing remarkable, just trees and wind. Yet for those who had once lived behind that wire, the place existed forever in memory, bound not by geography, but by sound. Merrick returned to Poland after months of wandering through ruined towns. He carried the violin in a cloth bag, its strings replaced many times, its surface marked by frost and fingerprints. It was no longer an instrument of music, but a relic of survival. He tried to resume life teaching, working, finding a rhythm in the world beyond the fences. But every note he played carried the echo of the camp, of nights when melody was the only proof that humanity still existed. He never performed publicly again. He played quietly, for himself, in the evenings, when silence became too heavy. Other survivors scattered across Europe, each carrying fragments of the same story. Some spoke of the camp orchestra, others remained silent, unwilling to recall a memory that felt both sacred and unbearable. The guards, too, vanished into history, some captured, some gone without trace. The moment when they had stood listening, clapping in the snow, became a secret none of them recorded. Years later, a historian researching wartime prisoner camps found a mention in an old report. Musical activity among prisoners. Morale satisfactory. No disciplinary risk. It was a single line in a file of statistics. The historian, curious, tried to trace its origin, but found only an empty record and a map with a red cross marking Camp No. 27. The rest had been erased by time. But the story survived in another way. In the 1,960 seconds, a journalist visiting Poland met an old man who played a rough, uneven tune on a violin held together by string and wax. When asked about it, the man smiled faintly and said it was written in a place where men had forgotten their names, but not their songs. He offered no further explanation. No monument was ever built for that camp. No plaque marked the spot where prisoners and guards once shared a few minutes of peace. Yet each winter, when the wind moves through the trees of that forest, it carries a thin, wavering sound, like distant music barely heard through the years. Perhaps it is only the wind, or perhaps it is what remains of those nights when melody crossed the wire, when men divided by war became, for a fleeting moment, a single audience. The camp may have vanished, but the echo of its music endures not in archives or history books, but in the quiet truth that even in captivity, beauty found a way to live.